On November 3rd, 1973, catastrophe would strike a passenger plane whilst it was cruising at high altitude over New Mexico. The case of National Airlines Flight 27 exposed just how delicate an airplane can be. For an airplane that was brand new and state-of-the-art at the time, this would be the first time this plane entered the news headlines for all the wrong reasons. First off, let's talk a little bit about this plane. You don't see it all too often today. This is the McDonnell Douglas DC-10. For longtime viewers of the channel, or for those with knowledge of aviation history, you'll know that the DC-10 has a certain negative reputation attached to it, and whether or not that is warranted is down to you, and we'll touch upon that in just a moment. But before we get ahead of ourselves, what was this plane really? The DC-10 was one of the first wide-body airliners. During the 1960s, plane manufacturers wanted to build larger planes. There was demand for it, considering the popularity of air travel only ever continued to grow following the end of World War II. Picking up on the lessons learned from previously manufactured aircraft, the big players in the aviation market each developed one of these larger planes, sometimes to the requirement of certain airlines. The first wide-body plane was the Boeing 747, launching in 1968. For some carriers, like American Airlines for example, they admired the range capabilities of the 747, but thought the plane was too big. As it turned out, ETOPS restrictions were loosened in the 1960s, effectively creating a new market for large tri-jet planes. McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed went with the three-engine design, resulting in the slightly smaller DC-10 and L-1011 launching in 1971 and 1972 respectively. So the DC-10 was actually very popular for its time. The iconic tail-mounted third engine, or I guess engine number 2, became synonymous with that late 20th century air travel era. Pilots of the plane loved the machine. You'll often hear former pilots of the DC-10 today talk favorably about the aircraft. However, the public and media perception of the DC-10, as you may already know, remained rather sour. This is attributed to a number of high-profile accidents involving the plane. Most notably, in its early days, there was a known issue with the plane's cargo door design, which led to multiple incidents, one of which killed over 300 people, becoming the deadliest air disaster to have ever occurred at that time, and even today still remains one of the worst air disasters to have ever occurred. Most accidents involving the DC-10, though, didn't really stem from the plane itself. External factors, everything from poor maintenance to pilot error, terrorist attacks, hijacking, or not informing the pilot of a waypoint change, to name a few, have all been leading causes in many of the disasters surrounding this plane's history. As time went on, it would turn out that the DC-10 was actually a very reliable plane. However, when you look into the history of the DC-10, you'll soon find that the term uncontained engine failure rears itself at multiple points throughout the plane's history. An uncontained engine failure basically refers to the failure of an engine where fragments of the internals are, for some reason, ejected from that engine. From looking into the history of this plane, it would appear that fatal uncontained engine failure events occurred with the DC-10 on 2 occasions. Today we'll be focusing on the first of these accidents, and it would actually be the first fatal incident involving the DC-10. And this brings us to Florida in 1973. One airline that flew the DC-10 right from the beginning was a Florida-based operator known as National Airlines. National was a cross-country carrier. They flew big planes across the United States, often coast to coast, making stopovers along the way. Flight 27 was one of those, Miami to San Francisco, with stopovers in New Orleans, Houston, and Las Vegas. On November 3rd, 1973, the New Orleans and Houston legs of Flight 27 were performed without issue. At 2:40 in the afternoon that day, the DC-10 continued its journey westward, carrying 128 passengers and crew on board. The flight to Las Vegas was just under 3 hours. The DC-10 requires 3 pilots to fly. The captain of Flight 27 was a man by the name of William Brooke. aged 54. He was a veteran pilot at the airline, having joined the company all the way back in 1946. Though he had a long career at the airline at that point, he, like many pilots at the time, was still somewhat new to the DC-10. His first officer, 33-year-old Edward Saunders, was the youngest member of the flight crew. Sat in the flight engineer's position was the eldest of the three men, 55-year-old Golden Hanks. He was the most experienced on the new DC-10, with over 1,200 hours logged on the type. By all accounts, this was a highly experienced crew. As the plane crossed the state border into New Mexico, the flight appeared to be running smoothly. For now, let's head outside of the plane. The DC-10, as you already know, has 3 engines. Engine number 3 is found on the right wing. The engine fitted onto this particular DC-10 had some known issues. In 1972, a compressor discharge pressure leak was noticed on the engine, which was reported to have been fixed. It was again inspected some time later and returned to the manufacturer due to, quote, deterioration of performance. Now may be a good time to mention that 15 different reports came in from pilots regarding this engine. It would appear that the bolts securing the forward housing of the engine were beginning to fail, so the engine was removed from the wing for repairs. But even despite this, problems persisted, and pilots complained a further 26 times. Investigators would later discover the issue on other DC-10s, and a fix for this would later become mandatory for DC-10 operators. At just before 4:40 in the afternoon, the conversation on the flight deck had changed, and little did the pilots know that the next 20 minutes of their lives would take a very unexpected turn. You see, the DC-10 was equipped with a newer generation of the autothrottle, which had already been around in varying forms for some time. It does exactly what you think it does. The autothrottle automatically governs the engine power to maintain a desired airspeed. The conversation between the 3 pilots was about how the autothrottle sourced the engine information to carry out its function. The pilots were curious about this piece of technology and wanted to see if the plane sourced its engine readings for the autothrottle from the N1 indication. So, what is N1? Well, for that, we're going to need to go inside the engine itself. Prepare for one of those disaster breakdown tangents. The early DC-10s were fitted with General Electric CF6 engines. This was a model of engine found on other planes of the day, including the Airbus A300, for example. This is a high-bypass turbofan engine. The fan sucks in that air. A large portion of that air, as the term high bypass suggests, actually just goes through the engine. We're not really interested in that today. What we're interested in is the compressor. To keep it simple, a compressor consists of a turning shaft made up of a number of these fans and blades. The engine compressors have to deal with a massive amount of air coming into the engine. The compressor's job is to, well, compress that mass of air into a much smaller volume. The supply of air must be constant for the engines to work. If air intake is cut, the compressors stall, and that is how an engine failure could occur, for example. On a large passenger plane, you can easily find over a dozen of these compressor stages all stacked up in a line. But of course, this depends on the design from the engine manufacturer. The purpose of the compression process is to extract the most energy from the air during the combustion stage. So now, to get even deeper into understanding your plane engines, let's go a bit further. There are 2 phases of compression: a forward low-pressure compressor and a rear high-pressure compressor. Both sets of compressors are connected to turbines at the back of the engine. The speed at which these spools are moving at is pretty pertinent information for a pilot. What we need to know for the sake of this video is that the value related to the speed of the low-pressure spools is often referred to in aviation as simply N1. N2 and even N3 are in relation to the high-pressure spools. N1 is usually calibrated so that it acts as a percentage parameter for total engine power. So the N1 reading is a very useful piece of information for a pilot. All of this will make a bit more sense in the context of National Flight 27 in just a moment. So let's go back to the flight. As previously mentioned, The conversation between the three pilots was about how the autothrottle worked on the DC-10. There are two ways the autothrottle worked on the plane. One setting works with the plane's airspeed, the other with the engine's N1 that we've already discussed. The pilots were curious to run a little experiment, to not only see whether the plane grabs the engine information for the autothrottle from the N1 gauge or the N1 tachometer, that's the device that actually measures the engine speed, but they were also testing to see if the autothrottle will continue to work in its airspeed mode if the N1 signal was cut. To do this, the pilots went outside of standard procedures. The circuit breakers relating to the N1 tachometers were pulled, so in theory, that information could not be accessed by the plane. When those relevant circuit breakers were pulled, there was no reported change in airspeed. The pilots went further and changed the airspeed setting on the autopilot panel, reducing the airspeed by 5 knots. The pilots watched as the throttles retarded themselves. The autothrottle was still in control, even whilst the signal to the N1 tachometers was pulled. This small experiment was brief, over the span of just a couple of minutes. The captain was satisfied with the result of the experiment, and the N1 tachometer circuit breakers were reconnected. The captain disconnected the autothrottle to take over manual thrust control. For a brief moment, the pilots probably thought that they were going to continue their flight to Las Vegas as normal. The previously mentioned number 3 engine had different plans. We need to make something rather clear here. It cannot be proven conclusively that there is a link between the pilot's experiment and what happened to this number 3 engine. The investigation stopped short of making that kind of connection. It may be possible that this was merely coincidental. Instead, this accident was attributed to a design flaw with the engine itself. Following the disconnecting of the autothrottle and reconnecting of the N1 tachometers, the blades of this engine accelerated, and for a brief moment, resonating frequencies between the blades and the engine housing caused enough vibration for the blades to come in significant contact with the housing, releasing, and to quote the FAA on this, catastrophic energy. What followed was a complete disintegration of the number 3 engine internals. The engine then exploded. Fragments of the engine inlet, fan casing, and the fan blades themselves penetrated the cabin and damaged numerous areas of the plane. Damage was done to the right wing, the engine housing of the other 2 engines, yes, the one all the way at the back of the plane in the tail too. The lower fuselage was damaged, and the passenger window of seat 17H on the right side of the plane had become dislodged. Despite the damage done to the plane, the pilots, luckily, could still control it. However, the electrical wiring connecting the number 3 engine generator to the rest of the plane had become severed, resulting in a temporary electrical outage on board. The opening of the fuselage at multiple points led to rapid decompression of the aircraft. In a single moment in the afternoon at 39,000 feet, Flight 27 just experienced an uncontained engine failure leading to decompression. The explosion of the engine was heard and felt in the cockpit. The plane swayed from side to side. Immediately, the pilots identified a decompression and began a rapid emergency descent to a lower altitude, 8,000 feet to be specific. At the same time, the pilots knew they needed to get on the ground as soon as possible. The time was 4:45 when the pilots of Flight 27 got in contact with controllers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and requested an emergency landing, specifically requesting runway 26 at Albuquerque, the straight-in approach from the east. The airport at Albuquerque began making their own preparations and rolled out the emergency vehicles. The pilots for some time would have been unaware of what was taking place in the cabin. As it turned out, there was a passenger occupying seat 17H, where a fragment of engine had dislodged the nearby window. When the decompression occurred, the energy of the air inside the plane being forced outward had actually taken this passenger with it. Seated in this unfortunate airplane seat was a Texas man by the name of George Gardner from Beaumont. He was traveling to Singapore on a business trip. Gardner, despite wearing his seatbelt, was picked up from his seat and partly ejected from the plane through the opening in the fuselage. Nearby, quick-thinking passengers stepped in and held onto the man. Unfortunately, the forces being exerted on this individual were too great, and Mr. Gardner was fully ejected from the plane. His remains reportedly wouldn't be discovered for over 2 years. The pilots, as previously mentioned, could control their plane, and thankfully at just before 5 p.m., they were able to land safely in Albuquerque, saving the lives of 127 people, though sadly, one person did perish. A further 24 passengers were treated for smoke inhalation. National Airlines Flight 27 had actually become the first fatal incident to involve the DC-10, the beginning of, maybe you'd say, a macabre trend in the 1970s. Even though investigators could not conclusively determine how the engine fan blades failed in this accident, enough was learned to make corrective measures to prevent future incidents. Though there were reported problems with the number 3 engine on the National Airlines plane, the aircraft was reported to have been maintained in accordance with regulations. In the aftermath, it was made mandatory that DC-10 operators review the plane's engines on all their DC-10 planes. Further recommendations were made to evaluate the effectiveness of then-current passenger oxygen supplies. For the first nearly 20 years of operation of DC-10s, Flight 27 in 1973 was the only major incident to involve an uncontained engine failure, and after 2 decades of operation, it would look as if there was no reason to suspect that another fatal engine incident like this would occur. Except, as you might know already, 16 years later, disaster struck again on a DC-10, and this time the pilots weren't so lucky. Perhaps one of the most shocking accidents to occur on American soil took place on July 19, 1989. A United Airlines DC-10 Flight 232 suffered an uncontained engine failure, this time involving the number 2 tail-mounted engine. When the failure occurred and the engine exploded, fragments of this engine damaged critical flight controls, and the pilots of Flight 232 were left with a plane they could barely control. The plane crashed at a small airport in Iowa, resulting in the deaths of 112 people. United Airlines Flight 232 will be subject to its own disaster breakdown video in the future. We had actually planned to have made it already, but upon closer inspection, it will be a much bigger video than expected. I should make it clear that these 2 incidents are not as related as you may first think. If you would like to learn more about the United Airlines disaster, I can recommend a recent episode of the Well There's Your Problem podcast, which goes into detail about this tragedy. Problems with the DC-10's engine didn't stop with United Airlines in 1989. On July 25, 2000, a Continental Airlines DC-10 was involved in a terrifying disaster in Paris. A fragment of the plane's engine broke away during takeoff. That piece of the airplane sat there on the runway, unbeknownst to anyone. Minutes later, an Air France Concorde ran over that fragment of a DC-10 engine. And you know what happened next. Another 113 people were killed. These days, uncontained engine failures have still occurred with other planes. When these incidents do occur, they are usually non-fatal. Pilots often train for scenarios like this, and it's thanks to all that we've learned that these incidents today usually end with a safe landing. To get back to the topic of our video today and to finish up, the Flight 27 DC-10 was actually repaired and it re-entered service. National Airlines was eventually acquired by Pan Am in 1980. They then sold the DC-10s to American Airlines, who eventually retired the accident plane in 1999. It was sold to FedEx, who scrapped the plane for parts. The DC-10 as a whole is largely a plane that is now confined to the history books. As of February 2023, just one DC-10 remains in commercial operation today in South America. FedEx, the largest operator of the plane in recent years, has now retired the type. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. This one actually took a bit longer than I thought to make, and it turned out to be a much longer video than I thought as well, but anyway, we all like longer videos, and here we are. If you enjoyed it, be sure to be subscribed, as there is always a new video every Saturday. And let's just say that I'm very much looking forward to sharing next week's video with you. It's a bit different, and I think you're going to really like it, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, it is time for Patreon. Big thanks to my patrons for their amazing support and contributions to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. So we have 4 shoutouts to do this week. Shout out to Anthony for pledging early on last week. Thank you so much for the support. Really appreciate it. And special thanks to Killian W68, Flying Unicorn, and Quizmaster Jake Brown. All those guys pledged at the highest tier this week. I can't thank you all enough. I really appreciate it. Legends. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 2 days before it goes out publicly on YouTube. Anyway, I think that's where we'll wrap things up for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye. Why did I wave? Why did I wave there?